William of Pagula, that's where we wanted to finish up today. And we left off with this, this idea, this suggestion, more than a suggestion, basically, a demand for a change in the way that the aristocrats and the peasants relate to each other. And he says that the king should make it a general rule that nothing should be taken for a lesser price than that which the seller is willing to give it. And part of his reasoning is, again, very characteristic of the medieval frame of mind. Okay, so it bears some thinking about here. He says that all things come from God. So originally, the property is not yours. So he's not a Lockean, he doesn't say that property is absolutely yours, you fix your labor with it, it becomes yours. Rather, it comes from God, and it is given to the king for good stewardship, okay? And it's the king's responsibility to protect it and to protect the people whom he basically rules over in his distribution of property. So property comes to the individual from God through the king, okay? And so, since God is the original owner and he gives it to the king to distribute and protect in trust, okay, then the king is responsible to God if he abuses that privilege, that power that he's got. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, even in Christian thought today, there's a similar concept here, but we usually don't think through the full implications of it. Has anybody heard the term stewardship? Okay, and that comes right from, the book of Genesis onwards, but particularly the book of Genesis where, we see God creating the earth, and then at the end of the process, he creates human beings, and he says, basically you need to take care of all of this. So the medieval thinker reads this and thinks, well, God gave the world and everything in it to Adam in trust to be a good steward over, okay? To take care of and to use to his advantage, but not to abuse other people and not to misuse. And so the property is not absolutely Adam's. It's not absolutely any of his heirs and all the people that came after him. It remains given to people in trust, and they are to be good stewards of it and protect it and to preserve it and to use it for the benefit of all mankind. Okay? Now, normally, since we live in a capitalist society, we hear that term stewardship and we think in terms of we still have private property, but we're not supposed to, we're supposed to be charitable, we're supposed to not use it to the exclusion to where other people are suffering, basically. But it's ours, absolutely, okay? When we hear the word stewardship, we still tend to think, this is mine to use however I want, but I have a moral obligation, to not abuse it if that hurts other people, okay? And usually that translates into an obligation to give part of what you have, in a charitable way to other people, okay? But I think that more was implied to people back then than just that. That there was this notion that the property isn't absolutely yours after all, okay? And it's not absolutely the king's, and it's not absolutely the nobility's, or if the peasants happen to have some property, it's not absolutely theirs either. They're all stewards of it. They're responsible to God. They're responsible to each other for how they use it. And so this is what William's reminding the king of. And so we have this teaching that the king and other property owners are the custodians of the property. And there's implications that have gone one way or the other about this, okay? Now, it leads to the question, what should be the government's role in the economy? If God is ultimately the owner of all property, so to speak, and he gives it to people in trust, okay? Then it's not a foregone conclusion that the economy will be a free trade economy. Okay? Now, in practice, medieval Christian thinkers did not usually go in the direction of something like socialism. Okay? Although they did note that early Christians shared, that the norm or the ideal anyway was for them to share everything in common. Okay? But they didn't tend to take that in the direction of saying the government ought to enforce the same and we ought to have some sort of socialist system. However, in modern times, some Christian thinkers do make that leap and say, this thinking really does lead to the idea that government ought to be involved in making sure that property is shared, that property is not literally owned and wielded by individuals, but is truly, commonly shared. And that is one direction that you can go in with the power of government. Okay? Most medieval thinkers, including Thomas Aquinas, William of Pagula, I don't think there's a single one that we're reading here that would not go in this direction, really did turn towards this idea of the duty of charity. Okay? So they were aware that you could go in the socialist direction. They were aware that you could interpret the biblical teaching to mean share everything, absolutely, but they didn't go there. And there were reasons why they tended to go with the duty of charity instead. Okay? So let's think a little bit about this. Why would most Christian thinkers decide that what the Bible demands or what God asks for is charity rather than the government making us share everything?
Just reading like the New Testament, that's a lot that Jesus spoke about was, personal charity of people. They didn't really talk about the government's involved, but they talked about just bringing people practicing charities, and it's probably a huge factor.
Yeah, there's lots of biblical evidence, especially in the New Testament, you're right, for our duty being interpreted this way, that it involves not us giving up everything to a common owner, but rather a duty to give a certain amount, to give as much as you can to others.
I think that they understood that charity mostly matters in the way that it was intended to be given. It's all about intention. And so if the government forces you to give to others, then maybe they didn't, is it really still charity?
Yeah. This is the pitfall for the socialist approach as far as the Christian angle is concerned, is that when government forces you, it's very well put, when government forces you to basically give up your property and for you to behave towards your fellow human beings in this way, then it takes away your ability to make the decision for yourself. And I think that's very well said, that intentions are very important from the Christian perspective. So just because you don't have property and everybody is sharing doesn't mean that anybody is a good Christian or has the proper motivation. Only when you're free to be selfish are you also free to be truly selfless. Okay? So I think that they learned, again, from Aristotle on this score. Aristotle was against Plato's communism for a lot of reasons, but he said that, when people have property, they have responsibility for it, right? If you take that away from them, then they're likely to actually become more selfish rather than less, because they will try to get whatever they can from the common without giving back, okay? So it doesn't help develop their character. And this teaching goes along well with the Christian perspective of proper intentions, and developing that altruism or giving spirit and so forth. So this is, many of the arguments surrounding why people should still have and own property had to do with that reasoning, that to bring out the charitable spirit. In fact, to actually love people, you have to willingly give, okay? Not unwillingly give. Does that make sense? Okay? So when the early Christians shared everything, they did so willingly. They weren't made by government to do that. They lived that way because they wanted to. Okay? No one forced them to. And that's fine. And many people in religious communities back then and even now live that way, right? So in monasteries and convents, there's not a lot of private property. You know, people might have a book or two and some personal effects, but they don't have a lot of personal property. So people can choose to live that way, and if they do, it's the best way. It's the best life possible. But for society as a whole, the best life possible is the life of charity, to have and own property, to make yourself responsible for it, and to actually obey the moral rule to share with others willingly. Okay, so you see, again, I'm trying to remind you, every time that, we tend to think that liberal ideas sort of came out all of a sudden in the 17th century, 17th and 18th century. But we get the foundations for them here. We get this thought going on about, should people be able to own property? Should they be able to control it themselves? Now, later liberal thinkers tended to de-emphasize the benefit of charity, okay? But they still took some of this reasoning very much to heart, especially the idea that if you don't own your own property, you're not responsible for it, okay? And then you're going to abuse it. So William and other thinkers help us to see the connection between the medieval thought and what came next. William argues, again, along lines similar to even John Locke, that when aristocrats take people's property in the way of purveyance, when they take it and they just give them whatever they say it's worth, and therefore they impoverish people, William said this is tantamount to murder. It's of the same moral significance as actually unjustly killing people. Now, why would he say that? Does anybody remember, or even what Locke had to say about that? Well, John Locke said, he was very influential with the American founders, and he said when a government has the ability to take your property without your consent, in the way of taxes, basically, it was what he was thinking. When government can tax you as much as it wants without your consent, then the government that can do that is also the government that can basically take your life, because it has the power to impoverish you, to totally disempower you, okay? And so it's a great threat. You've got to have the ability to say no, to have some sort of, in his view, political input so that you can stop government, from doing that. So William argues along surprisingly similar lines. Okay? He says, especially for these people who are living on the edge, who have very, very little in the way of property at all. If you take what little they have away, they will starve. They literally have, the purveyance literally can lead to people's demise. Okay? The father loses his income, and the family starves. The children can't survive. Okay? So this is a great power, and so he's making the connection here for the king between this policy that he more or less condones and people's actual survival. Okay? And he's already reminded the king that his number one duty, remember, his number one duty is the protection of people's lives. So here we have a policy that runs totally contrary to that. And again, this reminds us of the liberal view that government is there to protect our lives. And remember what they ended up saying. If it doesn't do that, what can you do? According to our founders, for instance.
Rise up against them?
Yeah, that's the justification for revolution. So, and again, we don't get a full-blown call for revolution in William's writing, but we get a lot of sharp criticism, and we get a reminder, well, this is what government's for. Preservation. self-preservation, basically, and preservation of the community. And if it doesn't do that, then it is condemned by God, okay? That's the point that he makes, okay? But later on, we have people saying, and actually our previous author did say, you know, tyrannicide, even Thomas Aquinas said that, tyrannicide is justified, okay, if a government is threatening your life in this unjust way. Those are pretty strong words and not all that dissimilar from that right to revolution that comes along later on. You know, although these liberal thinkers elaborate on it much further, okay? Whereas these medieval Christian thinkers are in the mode of basic condemnation, okay? But very similar. Okay, so next, unless there's any questions about that last point, any questions or comments about that? Well, next he talks about the king's spiritual life quite a bit. Okay? So instead of hammering him with the right to revolution, he basically tries to scare him with spiritual condemnation. Okay? I put this up here because, years ago now, probably like 15 years ago, I read a Christian novel called Left Behind. There's a whole series of these now. And I found it to be actually very exciting, surprisingly. I mean, I sort of went into it thinking, I had never read a Christian novel before. But it was very metaphysical, you might say, because the bad guys in this novel, literally, I mean, the novelist, I forget his name, but he would depict demons and, the devil in actual existence, swirling around, influencing people's behavior. So through the novel, you could see the actual, metaphysical entities of evil doing bad things. Now, most of the time in our world today, I think a lot of Christians don't believe that these things are actually quite real. Or if we talk about evil, we say evil comes from human beings, and that's what sin is, and so forth. But these novels leave you with the impression that the author thinks it's absolutely real and these entities do exist. And it kind of gets us back into the frame of mind of somebody like William of Pagula, because I think he thought that, definitely. You can see in his writings, these are real. And so in his imagination, when he thinks about the king's situation, he's probably thinking of demons literally, trying to grab the king's soul, okay? A real threat. Although they're invisible, a real threat to the king's soul. And he sees this as a sort of, there's a battle between good and evil going on here. All right? And there are people, he says, that are in the king's court who have tried to persuade him to condemn his, his nobles when they take advantage of the peasants. And then there are others who have more or less condoned this behavior. So William sees the king is surrounded by people both pro and con, okay? People who have actually dared to criticize and people who have condoned and said it's okay and have actually taken advantage, okay? And the way that he sees that is they are the forces of good and evil. They are either influenced by the devil or they're influenced by God, okay? Does that make sense? So, I mean, I realize people have all sorts of opinions about these issues, right? But if you're among those who don't think this way, it might be a little hard for you to grasp exactly how real this seems or is to people like William, okay? The way he sees it is this is a real battle, and it's going on right now. And the king is being pulled this way and that way. In fact, he's kind of like a pawn between the two. Okay? And the king needs to be made aware that the battle is going on, see, because he's not aware of it. He depicts the king, Edward, as sort of looking the other way or burying his head in the sand. not really wanting to think about it, allowing his friends to do whatever they want. Okay? So rhetorically, he gives him a little bit of wiggle room here. And he's very, very critical, but if you think about it, what he's saying is maybe the king's problem is ignorance. That perhaps he's just looking the other way and doesn't want to know. But what he needs to know is this, okay? That he's being pulled by these different forces, okay? And if he's aware of it, perhaps he'll change his mind, okay? So, as I said, in his court and his family, there are people who agree and disagree. He says, those who disagree are not your friends, but are enemies, and from the devil's household. Okay? I don't think William means that metaphorically. Okay? He means it literally. Now, think about how, if one believed this, how frightening that would be. Okay? So, I think he's hoping that William does believe it, and he probably did. I mean, you know, despite the fact that people believe these things, they still went astray, okay? But I think that these types of arguments had some force with folks reading them because they did believe, or could be made to believe. So if one took this seriously, then one would start to look at the different people around him and think, well, is this person from the devil? Has this person been sent from the devil to seduce me, to make me do something for the devil? Or is this person from God, sent from God, and is trying to persuade me to do right? Very, very strong language here on page 203. He says, because they seize the goods of others, they are seized by the devil, and by holding their injustice, they are held by the devil. For the sake of things belonging to others, which they thus seize, they sell themselves to the devil. So by making the decisions they make, okay, the people who do these unjust things have basically given themselves over to evil. And their soul is lost. Okay? And what happens when you die, when your soul has been lost like this, from their perspective?
Go to hell.
Yeah. So eternal damnation, potentially. Or at least a long, long time in purgatory, perhaps. Okay. But if you sold your soul to the devil, I would surmise that you might be there forever. So this is a huge threat, and it's a very frightening prospect. It held a lot of weight with people who believe. So this is a priest, of course, who's going to be, let's see, I want to make sure I get these in the right order. He's going to be using these kind of arguments, and I don't think there were a lot of people at his time who would have blown them off in the same way they were blown off a few centuries later by intellectuals. So he spends a lot of time warning William that just because he doesn't personally go out and do this, but allows his aristocrats to do it and condones it, he's just as guilty. In fact, he's even more guilty because he's the king and he's supposed to have this authority. He has the authority from God. Okay? He's supposed to use it well. So if he condones this, then he's in effect the worst case. Okay? So he begins to talk about spiritual poverty, and that Edward may indeed suffer from it. Now, you know, in the Beatitudes, Christ says, "Blessed be the poor in spirit," right? This is not what we're talking about here. Okay, he uses that term, but he couldn't mean the same thing, because in the Beatitudes it means something like meekness or humility or something like that. But when he talks about spiritual poverty, he's contrasting it with monetary wealth, okay? And what he's saying is that you may think that it's more important to be wealthy, or that that's a great good, but you should look to how your soul is doing, okay? And so he contrasts real, physical poverty with spiritual poverty, okay? And basically makes the point, which when you think about it is in resonance with, especially with Platonic thought, okay? He says that a person who is very poor, because he's been robbed, in effect, by the wealthy, is potentially spiritually rich, whereas the person who does the robbing is actually the poorer from this other point of view. Okay, so there's a strong contrast between what is good in a worldly sense and what is good in a spiritual sense. And of course, why would the spiritual side be more important?
Because you have eternal life in heaven.
Yeah, right, eternal life. Rather than, from the point of view of eternal life, your time on earth is just this little tiny blip, right? So if you rightly understand that, then you're going to pay much more attention to your spiritual wealth, so to speak, what you can store up in heaven, so to speak. So he reminds him of this. Therefore, also you can see, hopefully, it takes a little bit of creativity here, but can you see the democratization here? This is an overturning of values in a way, because the aristocrats have all, in the medieval societal structure, this landed wealth that they had, that they passed on from generation to generation, is what gave them the status and the power and the privileges that they had. And they looked on the poor as, basically their slaves. They're to do with them what they wanted, but to give them very little regard and to not recognize them as equal human beings. But, he's drawing on a Christian theme, which everybody knew about and everybody would have accepted, if they were asked, are the poor the children of God? They would say yes, but they don't act on it, and they don't actually seem to believe it. And so he's reminding him of this theme in Christian teaching, which elevates the status of the poor, okay? Which basically makes the poor, in a sense, more worthy than the rich, right? What's that teaching, that it's harder for the rich man to go through the eye of the needle, right, than to get into, or it's harder for him to get into heaven than to go through the eye of the needle, right? So it resonates with the Platonic thought too. Plato said a lot of the same thing, only having to do with political power. He said it's very difficult for a leader who has great political power to ever make it to heaven, because he's so fraught with temptations. So this elevates the common man, and particularly in Christian thought. Okay? Because the common person who's downtrodden is loved by God, has more of a chance of ending up in heaven. Well, it has some political implications down the road. That idea that the common person is equally, if not more, dignified and worthy than the wealthy. It overturns this idea of class distinctions. Okay? So while those were going to be in existence for quite a long time, the idea has a force and a power of its own. Okay? And as we move into modern times, it gets translated into the idea of individual equality, rights. Okay? So again, we see a connection there. He uses a couple of quotes from the Bible to kind of bring home his point about the fate of somebody like Edward. He says, from Amos, from the book of Amos, I will turn your festivals into funerals and all your songs into lamentations. Those who live lives of luxury, who ignore the needs of the poor, will enjoy for a time their worldly success, but in the end, they will suffer. And from Luke, he says, you who are full now, you will go hungry. You who now laugh, you will mourn and weep. And he comes right out and tells King Edward, and you can't get any more straightforward than this, right? Your great damnation must be feared. So really these are very revolutionary thoughts. When you literally apply the biblical point of view to political power, this is what you get. Is a condemnation of abusive power, a criticism of excessive wealth, okay? A call for treating people humanely, of recognizing equal human dignity. And while the metaphysical side kind of faded away in the development of Western political thought, a lot of the themes basically remain, okay, and got secularized. Now, let's see. After threatening him with eternal damnation, just the worst thing possible, he does end the piece that you have with a reminder of the worldly consequences too. And this is important because he obviously, like a lot of other medieval thinkers, has been influenced by more than just the Bible, but by, you know, the political thought that he's picked up, in his case, from the Roman thinkers primarily. But he says on page 206, therefore it follows that because they are neither of your household nor of your people, and on account of robberies and injustices of this kind, it is as if the whole people sorrows in the face of your coming. Wherever you may come in your kingdom, they are not of one mind with you, although they seem to be of one body with you. And indeed, if they had some leader, they would rise up against you. That's the closest thing, that's the closest he gets to the right to revolution. Okay. He's talking about rebellion there, that, you know, people will have fed up and have enough. So if they had some leader, they would rise up against you, just as they did against your father, and in truth you will not have any multitude of people with you. But if you keep as many as 30 or 40 good men with you in your household, and not such men as those who commit robberies of this kind, then you will have the whole land with you, and you will acquire the love of the multitude of the people, and in no other way. Okay. So the worldly benefit of changing his behavior is he gets the support of the people. The worldly cost is he may have a rebellion. He doesn't preach the absolute right to revolution, but he warns, you know, people will eventually get so fed up that they can, you know, I wish I could tell you the reference to his father. Apparently his father must have had a rebellion. I might look that up and see what that was. That would be interesting. But something in this family's past, apparently his father behaved the same way and got this kind of result. So he's reminding them of that. As if to say, you know, if the spiritual consequences don't get you, then think about what it takes to run an effective government and avoid these kind of troubles. Okay? Pretty much discussed that, but I'll just leave you with this. Now this is the type of writing that we've just witnessed here with William of Pagula is the type of writing that Thomas Hobbes condemned. Okay? Thomas Hobbes condemned it even though he was a social contract thinker, because Hobbes was a transitional thinker who still wanted to advocate for absolute monarchy. He thought that people should build a social contract and give up their rights to a sovereign power to protect them. Okay? So he didn't like thinkers like William because he saw within them this revolutionary impulse. Okay? So he condemned them as, he had used a variety of terms, but he called them ghostly men, which means, you know, people who believe in these spiritual realities. Okay? Hobbes spent quite a bit of time writing, this was from the 17th century, writing against the existence of these spiritual entities. Okay? And his reasoning was, if people believe these exist, if people believe, for instance, like William, that there's this literal battle between good and evil going on, then they will think more of their eternal future than they do of the present moment, and this will embolden them, and they're more likely to revolt. So he argued against them. The reference to schoolmen or scholastics is a criticism of their method. He didn't like he said that their writing was too obscure, and it was full of spiritual terms that could not be defined well, and that had no real substance or meaning, because Hobbes was a materialist. Okay? So he reasoned if you can't see it, then it doesn't exist. And so these schoolmen talked a lot about, good and evil, God and devil, and but what did any of this mean? So Hobbes recognized within this older way of writing this revolutionary impulse. The irony is that he came up with this idea of the social contract and the idea of a natural right, the right to self-preservation. And not a generation went by before people started using Hobbes's reasoning to justify the right to revolution. They used the same idea of the social contract, of individual rights, the role of government to protect people's lives, okay, to justify revolution. So Locke, for instance, learned a lot from Hobbes, but just turned it around, okay, disagreeing with his support for absolutism.